I was doing all my work in one room at home at this time, so I used them for both my music and my video production. They replaced a pair of equally sized Reflex speakers, but more on that later. A couple of years ago, I decided to split my video, which I consider work, from my music, which these days is my hobby, work-life balance and all that. So since I didn't have my second pair of NS-10M studios at that point, I bought a similar pair of speakers which were also closed box. Again, more on that later. These were fine to work with, but they didn't suit me quite so well as the Yamahas. So when a pair of NS-10M studios came up on that popular auction site you may have heard of, at the right price, I snapped them up and drove 200 miles there and back to get them. For completeness, I'll mention that since these speakers are passive, they need power amps to drive them. I'm using what some people might call cheap, but I'd call them good value, Chinese Class D amps, and they work just fine, not holding me back from my Grammy. So this is where I am, making videos in my video studio and quote-unquote music in my music studio. This is what I call a happy life. I'm keeping history to a minimum here, but if you want some of that, I'll refer you to Phil Ward's excellent article in Sound on Sound, September 2008, which is online. But the essentials are that at some point in the late 70s or early 80s, the story goes that producers realised that they could carry around a small pair of speakers from studio to studio, position them close to, or in the near field as we say, and enjoy a consistent acoustic environment. I think that's a pretty good history lesson in around 50 words. Now, for most of us, the near field part has faded into irrelevance because we work in rooms so small that there isn't space for anything else. If you're not among most of us, then congratulations, we envy you. The fact that the NS-10M was anointed by the production gods and goddesses rather than any other model does though need explanation. I'll start with what's wrong with the NS-10M studio, and there's a lot wrong. Firstly, if I say that there's no bass, clearly that's an exaggeration, or a hyperbole if I want to sound posh. I'll put it like this, it feels like there's no bass. So if I put a 42 Hz sine wave through the NS-10M studio, which is the fundamental of the lowest note of a standard bass guitar, I can just about hear it. And what I can hear may just be second or third harmonic distortion. If I touch one of the cones gently, I can feel that it's working hard, but all that hard work is having little effect on my ears. This, obviously, is bad. If you're producing or mixing and there's something bad going on down in those low frequencies, you're not going to hear it. The solution, I find, is to check on headphones, and I wouldn't let a mix leave my room without doing that. What's also bad is the frequency response of these speakers, other than the bass. There's a useful paper linked from Phil Ward's article that I mentioned earlier that quotes the frequency response of the Yamahas as being plus or minus 5 dB from 85 Hz to 20 kHz, which when you consider the response of the rest of the equipment that we use, other than perhaps microphones, is as flat as an optical bench. This is not good. Not good being nearly a synonym for bad. So, if two wrongs don't make a right, then surely two bads don't make a good. Well, the lack of bass response can't ever be a good thing. You could use a subwoofer, and I haven't so far, but I wouldn't mind giving it a try. But there's an upside. When you're mixing bass, you want your listeners to hear it. And how many listeners have speakers that go down to 42 Hz? I reckon that in this age of Bluetooth, smart speakers, earbuds and the like, it will be comparatively few. So what you'll do is make sure that your listeners can hear some harmonics. Rough it up a little bit so there's a bit of warmth, and the wonders of the human hearing system will ensure that the listener hears the pitch of E 2 and a bit octaves below middle C, even if the fundamental is virtually absent. But other than the bass, what about the wonky frequency response? It has been said, and I believe it, that the reflection from a mixing console's surface ameliorates this, to the extent that the Yamahas are flat enough. Not flat, but flat enough. Add to that it's also been said, and I also believe it, that the frequency response of the Yamahas helps with mixing vocals. There are few things that can go more wrong in a mix than the vocals being harsh. The Yamahas will not let you do this. The quite pronounced peak between around 1 and 2 kHz will tell you when to tone things down. I feel that I've been rabbiting a bit on the flaws of the Yamaha NS-10M studios, and flaws there are. But there are considerable benefits that you'll find hard to get elsewhere. So I'm going to imagine a mast, and in my imagination nail my imaginary colours to it. I like closed box. Closed box. There, I've said it. OK, I know that you know this, but a bit of revision will tell us that with a speaker that's closed all round, the springiness of the air inside the cabinet is fighting the movement of the woofer cone. But at a tuned port, tuned to the right frequency of course, there are great big long equations for this, and cabinet size for size, the bass response can be extended down to lower frequencies. More bass! What's not to like about that? Well, what manufacturers of bass reflex loudspeakers will normally be quite slow to tell you is that the resonance of the port causes resonance. Maybe not so much in terms of frequency, but certainly so in terms of spreading the bass out over time. If you've ever seen so-called waterfall charts of loudspeaker responses, and if you haven't, you really should look the term up, you will notice that speakers do tend to resonate over time at some frequencies more than others, and some speakers resonate more than others. The worst culprits? Bass reflex. The noble knights in shining armour? Closed box. The Yamaha NS-10M and NS-10M Studio? Closed box. I could say QED here, but I strongly recommend checking out the paper linked in Phil Ward's September 2008 Sound on Sound article, where you'll see waterfall charts of a range of speakers. And which resonates least? The Yamaha NS-10M. Well, it's a close call between that and a couple of others. But really, some of the more resonant speakers, well, they're so resonant, it's scary. Science. Who believes any of that? Well, unfortunately, my sarcasm emoji isn't available right now, but it is reasonable to consider whether what works in facts and figures translates to the real world of subjectivity, which, apart from designing bridges, sending rockets to Mars, open heart surgery and the like, is the final arbiter of so many things in our lives. I'm perfectly sure that there are many people who can describe and explain the science of all of this much better than I can. But what matters to me is whether I can get a good result. What happens in between, in facts and figures, isn't so important, as long as it works. So let me go back to the speakers I was using for my music before I bought my second pair of Yamahas. No mystical secrets here. B&W DM100s, small loudspeakers intended for bookshelf listening in the home. I mention this because I had a pair in the 1980s, and as with the Yamahas, I found them easy to mix on to get my personal best results. But then came the error of my ways. I switched to B&W 801s, huge, and as near field as I could get them. These, I really do have to say that they're great to listen on, and I still have them now on either side of my television. But, and they're closed box again, they really do just sound too pleasant. In my view, and I recognise that opinions will differ, it was too easy to make a mix that sounded good but wouldn't maximise its potential on other systems. And then things got worse. Reflex. Still near field, but reflex tuned. I'm not going to name them because for what they are, I think they're good speakers, and people who like the reflex sound will like them, I'm sure. But for me, this is key, the reflex sound. Bass reflex speakers really do sound, to me, too reflexy. And considering near-field placement, this can be exaggerated by the position of the port and the acoustics of the room. I'll just throw in there that not all may be lost, and active reflex speakers with some bass management can be tamed considerably. And then I replaced the reflexes with another pair of B&W DM100 bookshelves, firing on all cylinders again. I have at some point to ask myself whether I really like the Yamaha NS-10M studios, or have I just gotten used to them? There's a bit of both in the answer to these questions. Do I like them? Well, if I consider listening for pleasure, that might be a different issue to listening for work, even my music, which I've said I regard as a hobby. Well, believe it or not, I am human, and I do things other than work from time to time. So I might, for instance, brace yourself, watch YouTube videos at my desk. Actually, this is probably more work than anything else because the topics are usually work or music related in some way.